The term fragging, or the deliberate killing of your military colleagues, was coined during the Vietnam War. It was a shockingly common phenomenon during that conflict, but why? Why were American soldiers killing their own officers? What drove them to do it? How did they get away with it? And what impact did this unprecedented level of murderous insubordination have on how the military operates today? Before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about the Vietnam War and how it all began. The Vietnam War lasted from 1955 to 1975, making it a 20-year-long hell for all involved on both sides. It was a divisive conflict, and to this day, many Americans question if the United States should have gotten involved. The main driving force for the United States invasion of Vietnam was the domino theory, the belief that if one country were to become communist, all of the neighboring countries would do the same. The U.S. feared communism would spread to South Vietnam and the rest of Asia. In an attempt to stop this from happening, the U.S. government sent supplies, funding, and military advisors to South Vietnam, involving the United States in what was, at the time, a civil war. Ho Chi Minh was the leader of the Viet Minh, a communist resistance army that fought against the Japanese and French occupation. Ho Chi Minh wanted to unite Vietnam under a communist government. The country had been under French colonial rule since the 19th century, and during World War II, the country had been invaded by Japan. When Japan was defeated in 1945, they withdrew from Vietnam, and this would be the first domino falling. If you'll pardon the metaphor, that would lead to the Vietnam War. Emperor Bao Dai was in control of the country until he abdicated in 1945 at Ho Chi Minh's urging, leaving the country in the hands of the Viet Minh. Bao Dai spent a year as supreme advisor to the Viet Minh until he left Vietnam for Hong Kong, but the French and Viet Minh continued to unsuccessfully ask him for political support. When a coalition of Vietnamese anti-communists formed a national union, they told Bao Dai they would support him, but only if he would seek independence for Vietnam. Bao Dai would align himself with them. In 1955, Ngo Dinh Diem, a staunchly anti-communist politician, became president of the government of the Republic of Vietnam. Both sides had the same goal of a united Vietnam, but drastically different ideas on what a unified Vietnam would look like politically. Ho Chi Minh and his supporters wished for a communist government, while Bao Dai and Ngo Dinh Diem looked for a government closer to what existed in Western countries. Diem's forces received training and equipment from the United States military and the CIA, and they would use this to punish Viet Minh sympathizers in the South. Diem would refer to them as the Viet Cong, meaning Vietnamese communists. He had 100,000 people arrested, of which many were tortured and executed. In the United States, America was equally divided on the war. The first substantial student protest occurred in October 1963. At the time, the United States had only sent American military advisors to Vietnam, but students across the United States were speaking out, and they were united under the belief that the Vietnam War was wrong. The protests grew in strength as the conflict escalated, and some of the protests turned violent. When American troops were sent to Vietnam, they were surrounded by death and cruelty. American soldiers had to go up against the Viet Cong, who relied on guerrilla methods. They set traps in the jungle and would ambush American soldiers. And crucially to what would follow, many of the American soldiers were also not there voluntarily, but brought over due to the ongoing draft. Out of 27 million eligible men, the United States drafted 2.2 million American men during the Vietnam War. Although only 25% of the military were draftees, it also spurred a lot of men into joining the military to avoid being drafted into it. There were a lot of people who did everything in their power to avoid the draft, including intentionally failing aptitude tests and fleeing to Canada. It's not surprising that resentment would build between soldiers and their superiors. Although the total is incomplete, from 1969 to 1972, there were around 900 cases of known or suspected fragging during the Vietnam War, which resulted in 99 deaths and an untold number of injuries. From 1970 to 1971, the incidence of fragging increased even as the United States was withdrawing from Vietnam. But by the end of the war, it's believed at least 450 officers and 600 United States soldiers had been killed by fragging, and 1,400 had died under mysterious circumstances. Fragging was not new, as similar incidents had occurred prior to the 1960s, but it became far more prevalent. It was a way for soldiers to discourage those in charge from being too enthusiastic for combat. As the Vietnam War grew more and more unpopular, the soldiers lost morale. They saw no reason to risk their lives for a losing war that many of them didn't even support. There were a lot of soldiers who were given a one-year tour of duty, and this meant there was less cohesion among units. For some, it was self-preservation, killing their officers to ensure they might get out of the Vietnam War alive. American soldiers were staring down the Viet Cong as the United States was making little progress in the war. At times, fragging was used in order to remove leaders that soldiers viewed as incompetent or a threat to their survival. Soldiers resented that unit leaders would risk their soldiers' lives for personal gain. Fragging had surprising consequences, such as opium addiction among American soldiers. In some units, soldiers used fragging in order to fight anti-drug policies, so officers would tolerate drug use and general insubordination among their soldiers due to a fear of fragging. Without any restrictions on narcotics, drugs became freely available to the already traumatized soldiers. There were incidents where unit leaders who were considered too strict would be given warnings from soldiers. When a unit leader would enforce discipline or regulations, sometimes they would find a frag grenade with a safety pin left in it and their name written on it in their bunk. Other times, soldiers might have discharged a smoke grenade under their bunk. These always had a loud and clear message, and unit leaders would back down due to the threat of fragging. If you're wondering if anyone was ever caught committing the offense, it wasn't many, and even fewer people were convicted of the crime. Lower-ranked GIs united to protect their fellow soldiers, and they helped make it difficult to identify the guilty party of the incidents. Of those who had been convicted, they were given incredibly light sentences. Some were sentenced only to 10 months in jail. There were some notable incidents. In 1969, after the assault on Hamburger Hill, there was an underground GI newspaper that had placed a $10,000 bounty on Lieutenant Colonel Weldon Honeycutt's head. Honeycutt had ordered and led the attack at Hamburger Hill, and the bounty had led to several unsuccessful attempts on Honeycutt's life. Hamburger Hill was a 10-day battle where in a remote valley in South Vietnam, American troops fought for control of a 3,000-foot-tall hill. After days of a bloody and vicious battle, they were able to take the hill, but they would abandon it only days later. After they abandoned it, the North Vietnamese would return to reoccupy it. Many saw it as a senseless loss of lives, and the debate continues to this day. Anger over the loss of life most likely incentivized American soldiers to want Honeycutt dead. In 1970, in Vietnam's Quang Ngai province, 25-year-old Captain Scott Edward Schneider was the commander of United States Army Artillery Battery. At 1:40 a.m. on August 17th, he was killed when an American soldier threw a frag grenade into his quarters while he slept. He died instantly. Private David K. Laughlin would be charged with his murder. 19-year-old Laughlin was described as a druggie, known for using hashish, LSD, and meth. He was also known for consuming a 6-ounce bottle of obesitol on a daily basis. Obesitol was a drug that combined several amphetamine salts in order to treat obesity. Laughlin would spend most of his time in a nearby village with a group of Marines. One of his platoon mates recalled that he would spend his time smoking opium with the old men. He was assigned menial chores, mostly due to his drug habit and absences, and he was prohibited from operating complex artillery. Schneider would eventually demote him from specialist to a private, or an E4 to an E1. They believed Laughlin's motive for the murder was a drug-induced grudge. Laughlin would plead guilty to unpremeditated murder, and he was sentenced to 25 years of hard labor. In 1979, Laughlin would be released after just 8 years and 7 months of his sentence. While drugs played a large part in fragging, racial tension was also considered a motivating factor in some cases. On March 15, 1971, at an Army base in Bien Hoa, Lieutenants Thomas A. Delwo and Richard E. Harlan, 2 white men, were killed by a grenade being thrown into their sleeping quarters. When Billy Dean Smith, a black private, was arrested for the crime, the prosecution argued that Smith had actually meant to target Captain Randall L. Rigby and First Sergeant Billy Willis due to their racist encounters with Smith. When Smith's case received international attention, it was moved from Vietnam to Fort Ord, California. The defense argued that the grenade pin had been planted in Smith's pocket after the attack. They alleged he had been targeted due to his anti-war statements prior to the murders. According to Black Scholar magazine, Smith was the logical guilty party because he was a black GI with a bad attitude. Billy Dean Smith was found not guilty. It wasn't unusual for the fragging incidents to miss their intended target. In 1969, a new commander was put in charge of Battery D of the 11th Marines at Phu Loc. Due to his style of discipline, he became unpopular with some of the Marines. On February 27th, someone threw a grenade into his sleeping quarters hoping to frag him, but he wasn't in his quarters that night. Instead, the explosion would kill First Sergeant Warren E. First, who was scheduled to return home to his family in just a few days. They never convicted anyone of his murder. At the Quang Tri Combat Base on April 21, 1969, someone threw a grenade into the company office of K Company, 9th Marines. First Lieutenant Robert R. Roweller would die as a result of the explosion. Private Reginald F. Smith would go on to brag to a colleague about the murder, which led to him being apprehended. As he told of his exploits, he still had the grenade ring on his finger. Smith would plead guilty to the murder, and he was sentenced to 40 years. He wouldn't finish his time though. On July 25, 1982, he was murdered by a fellow inmate. Army captain and incoming commander of the 188th Military Police Company, Roy Moore, was strict. When he arrived near Da Nang, he would quickly discover that some of the MPs had developed addictions to drugs and alcohol. Moore comfortably filed disciplinary charges against addicted and insubordinate soldiers. Unsurprisingly, he received threats of fragging. One night, Moore was told that one of his soldiers, Kidwell, a known drug user, had shot First Sergeant Howard and planned to attack Moore next. Moore took precautions to defend himself against Kidwell, only to discover he'd already been taken into custody and was in his office. Kidwell was court-martialed and First Sergeant Howard survived the attack. The United States Army wasn't the only one contending with fragging. It was prevalent in the Australian military as well. Lieutenant Robert Thomas Convery of the 9th Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment died on November 23, 1969 at the age of 22. After a night of heavy drinking with his battalion, a grenade was placed in his tent in Nui Dat around midnight. He was killed when the grenade exploded as he slept. He was due to return home in 5 days. Later on, Private Denzel Allen would be convicted of his murder and sentenced to a life sentence in Riston Prison, but he would only serve 10 years and 8 months. In one case, a booby trap may have saved a man's life. Eugene Linden was an American author who once wrote about the demoralization of American troops in Vietnam in a 1971 Saturday Review article. He told the story of a company commander in the 23rd Infantry Division. The captain was injured when he fell on a punji stick, a booby trap that's a simple spike made from sharpened bamboo. It turns out this was a life-saving event, as it removed him from combat. He was informed by a medic that all of the men in his unit were most likely pleased that he'd fallen on that stick. The medic explained to him that his unit felt he constantly put his men in danger and lacked common sense. The men had been talking about fragging him until he fell on that punji stick. Fragging statistics mostly cover incidents that involve explosives, typically grenades, but there are also several hundred murders by firearms. In those cases, it was typically men of equal rank shooting each other, though. According to the statistics on hand, less than 10 officers were killed by their colleagues via firearms. There were rumors of enlisted soldiers deliberately killing officers and non-commissioned officers using the chaos of the battlefield to get away with it. Another incident at Nui Dat involved Private Paul Raymond Faraday opening fire into the sergeant's mess of the Royal Australian Army Service Corps with his SLR rifle. On December 25, 1970, Faraday shot and killed Sergeants Alan Brian Moss and Wallace James Galvin and wounded Sergeant Frederick Edwin Bodle. He committed the crime after an all-day drinking session. Faraday was described as being paranoid and prone to fits of rage by an Army psychiatrist during his court-martial. Witnesses would state that Faraday was aware of his own actions, and they provided details of previous altercations with Faraday. Faraday would be convicted on 2 counts of manslaughter and 1 assault with a weapon. Of his 10-year sentence, Faraday only served 8. The United States military began to instill tougher restrictions on access to weapons to try to minimize the number of fraggings. They would instill post-fragging lockdowns until the investigation was completed. In May 1971, the United States Army had to temporarily stop issuing grenades to all units in Vietnam, and they confiscated weapons, ammunition, grenades, and knives. Despite their best efforts, this didn't reduce the amount of fragging incidents. If they couldn't get it from the American military, soldiers would find weapons through the black market in Vietnam. Fragging played a role in why the United States switched to an all-volunteer military, dropping the draft altogether. Nixon signed the legislation to end conscription on September 28, 1971, but it wouldn't go into effect until January 27, 1973. When Nixon ran for president in 1968, he had promised he would end the draft. Nixon also believed that ending the draft would put an end to protests. He thought that middle-class Americans would lose interest in the war if they didn't fear that they or their loved ones might be sent to fight. Despite running on that, Nixon wouldn't act on his promise for the first years of his presidency. In fact, a draft was originally due to expire in June 1971. Instead of allowing it to expire, Nixon asked Congress to approve a 2-year extension on it. They'd even compiled draft priority numbers for men born in 1954, 55, and 1956. Congress would not extend the draft, though. Vietnam led to a great deal of resentment from American soldiers. Many soldiers were also faced with Agent Orange, a mixture of herbicides that the United States used to clear foliage. It was meant to take away the Viet Cong's hiding places, but it's also believed that nearly 3 million American soldiers might have been exposed to Agent Orange. Many of these soldiers who were exposed later developed cancer or other medical problems, including Parkinson's disease. In 1979, United States veterans were able to bring a class action lawsuit against the 7 herbicide manufacturers who produced Agent Orange. They would settle out of court in 1984, creating a $180 million fund to compensate 250,000 victims and their families. It's also believed that exposure to Agent Orange is responsible for abnormally high amounts of miscarriages, skin disease, cancers, birth defects, and congenital malformations among Vietnamese people in the 1970s. American soldiers not only witnessed brutality, they participated in it as well. On March 16, 1968, the United States committed one of its darkest atrocities during the Vietnam War in the village of My Lai. The village of 700 civilians was invaded by the Charlie Company, 11th Brigade American Division, and they slaughtered 504 Vietnamese innocents, including children, within 3 hours. There were no reports of opposing fire from the village, but Lieutenant William Cawley, the commander of the unit, ordered his troops to enter the village firing. Civilians were clubbed, stabbed, and women were assaulted. The soldiers mutilated some of their victims by carving C Company on their chests. Only one American was injured during the massacre when he accidentally shot himself in the foot while he was clearing his pistol. Robert Maples, one of the soldiers at My Lai, refused to open fire at the Vietnamese civilians in a ditch. His commanding officer trained his own weapon on him, and Maples still refused. Meanwhile, helicopter pilot Hugh Thompson Jr. threatened to open fire on his fellow Americans, desperate to protect the Vietnamese villagers from being massacred. He threatened to report the massacre as well. He had blocked the American soldiers with his helicopter, and he had his crew aim their guns at the American troops and rescued villagers hiding in a bunker. When Thompson noticed movement in one of the ditches, he landed so the crew chief, Glenn Andreotta, could rescue a young boy from the ditch. The boy was covered in blood but uninjured. Thompson would report the incident to his army officers, but while that did lead to a ceasefire, it also led to a cover-up. The United States military would work diligently to keep what happened in My Lai a secret. L. Mendel Rivers, the chairman of the House of Armed Services Committee, would later claim that Thompson was the only guilty party there that day since he was the one who had turned his gun on his fellow Americans. It's no surprise that Thompson would throw away the Distinguished Flying Cross that they'd awarded him for saving the lives of the Vietnamese villagers. When given the medal, the citation made no mention that the hostile fire he faced was from the American side. Thompson believed the United States military wanted to buy his silence. He would receive the Soldier's Medal in 1998, but he refused to accept unless they gave the award to his door gunner, Lawrence Colburn, and the late Andreotta. Sadly, Glenn Andreotta had died in a crash 3 weeks after My Lai. The United States military couldn't keep the lid on My Lai forever, especially after Ron Rittenhour, a 22-year-old gunner in another unit, wrote letters to 30 congressional and military officials a year later. Someone connected to the military called a part-time political columnist from the Village Voice to tell them about a United States soldier being court-martialed for the massacre at the Vietnamese village, but the Army didn't want anyone reporting on it. Naturally, the columnist, Jeffrey Cohen, was interested. He called a freelancer named Seymour M. Hirsch and told him about the story, and it was Hirsch who would dig deeper into what had happened. Hirsch would fly out to Salt Lake City to meet with Cawley's lawyer, and he would travel to Fort Benning, walking around the base until he found Cawley to interview him. Hirsch would uncover the story for the American public, later winning the 1970 Pulitzer Prize for international reporting. When the public learned about the My Lai massacre, anti-war sentiments rose further. The investigation into the massacre uncovered widespread failures in leadership, discipline, and morale. The United States military had lost many career soldiers over the course of the ongoing war. If they hadn't been rotated out or retired, they were killed. They'd been replaced with draftees who lacked experience. Military officials blamed the disappointing talent pool for the military deteriorating. They argued that if they had more educated middle-class draftees, someone like Cawley, an unemployed college dropout, would have never been the leader of a unit. Although he had dropped out of college, in 1967, Cawley had managed to graduate from Officers Candidate School at Fort Benning, Georgia. Cawley would testify that he was ordered by Captain Ernest Medina to carry out the slaughter in My Lai. However, all the photographic and recorded evidence pointed to Cawley alone. Cawley was sentenced to life in prison, but he was released in 1974. He was given a dishonorable discharge and entered the insurance business afterward. The Vietnam War was in hindsight a travesty for all involved, with flaws that cost countless thousands their lives trickling down from the very top of leadership. Fragging is just one more shade of red amidst the overall atmosphere of tragic, bloody chaos. Now watch Dirty Secrets of the Vietnam War You Didn't Know About. or most insane booby traps used during the Vietnam War.